The year is 2027. Moscow's Red Square is surrounded by bread lines not seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The ruble, it's worth a fraction of what it once was. And the oligarchs who once docked their yachts in Monaco, many are selling off their mansions just to keep their companies afloat. Might sound like fiction. After all, this is Russia, the energy superpower expected to outlast any Western pressure. The country that Vladimir Putin promised would emerge victorious from its so-called special military operation. But Russia's economic fortress was built on unstable ground. What we're witnessing isn't just a recession, it's the early stages of a collapse, one that could make the 1990s look like a time of prosperity by comparison. Right now, one of the world's largest economies is burning through its reserves while trying to protect the image that everything is under control. In today's video, we break down why Russia's future looks far more like 1990s than the 2020s, and why the numbers suggest that the unraveling has already begun. Let's begin with a scenario that would have been unthinkable just 3 years ago. Russia's economy is running on borrowed time in the most literal sense. The government is spending so aggressively that even Kremlin-aligned economists are showing signs of concern. Consider the National Wealth Fund, Russia's emergency reserve built from years of oil and gas profits. Since 2022, it's been repurposed to finance the ballooning federal budget deficit driven by sanctions and wartime military spending. In the process, it has been drained by more than half. What was once a $210 billion safety net is now down to just $56.5 billion in liquid assets. That's not just belt-tightening, it's a hemorrhage, and it gets worse. At the current burn rate of around $25 billion per year, the fund's liquid reserves could be completely exhausted by late 2025 or early 2026. No cushion, no buffer, nothing left. The Kremlin may continue calling this a special military operation, but financially, it's closer to economic suicide. Russia is eroding the foundation of its economy to sustain a war effort it cannot afford. And this crisis extends far beyond budget deficits. Consider the lived experience of ordinary Russians. A factory worker in Nizhny Novgorod who was middle class just 3 years ago, decent job, modest vacation, some savings, is now spending over a third of his income just on food. In April 2025 alone, food expenses reached 34.6% of household income, up 6% from the year before. That kind of squeeze hits hardest at the everyday level, long before anyone calls it a crisis. According to the Samakba think tank, which advises the government, inflation for low-income households, factoring in basic necessities like food, medicine, and utilities, reached over 20% in April 2025. Russian households spent nearly 35% of their income on food in April, a 5-year high. But the real shock is in the produce aisle. Potato prices, a staple for many, have exploded. According to Russia's own statistics agency, Rosstat, prices rose 92% in 2024. By May 2025, they were up 166.5% year over year, the highest annual surge since records began in 2002. While ordinary people are struggling to buy potatoes, the government continues to pour money into its war machine. Economists have called it a sugar-high economy, fueled by unsustainable military spending. In 2024, Russia's inflation reached 9.5%, largely driven by defense and security expenditures, which are set to consume 41% of the state budget in 2025, an estimated $145 billion, according to Reuters. Nearly half of all government spending is going into the military. That's not an investment in growth. It's a short-term fix with long-term damage. And despite this, economic performance is still declining. In Q1 2025, Russia's GDP growth slowed to just 1.4%, down from over 4% the year before. This is not a soft landing, it's a hard stall. And the surface-level numbers don't even capture the deeper threat, a hidden debt crisis that's already bubbling beneath the surface. What's not being discussed openly, and what may be even more destabilizing than inflation, is the hidden financial structure propping up Russia's war. Behind the official budget, Moscow is pursuing a two-track strategy to finance military expansion. In addition to its publicly declared defense spending, the Kremlin has created a shadow financing mechanism, pressuring domestic banks to issue soft loans to defense contractors at rates far below market value. Since 2022, Russian banks have been compelled to issue between $210 billion and $250 billion in loans to military industries. This isn't coming from the state treasury. It's money forced out of private institutions. These are loans unlikely to ever be repaid. To put this in perspective, Russia's official defense budget stands at $145 billion as of 2025. With these covert loans, the real figure is effectively double that, and the debt is sitting on the balance sheets of commercial banks. At Sberbank, one of Russia's largest lenders, the volume of distressed mortgage loans jumped by 90% between January and March, reaching 285 billion rubles, about $3 billion. These aren't just red flags, they're alarm bells. Here's how the system works. Banks are ordered to lend to defense manufacturers at artificially low interest rates. The manufacturers use the money to produce weapons, most of which are sent directly to the front lines. There's no commercial return, no ability to repay. Meanwhile, ordinary businesses are stuck borrowing at rates over 21% because banks are trying to balance out losses elsewhere. It's a classic case of economic cannibalism, the war economy draining the civilian economy to keep itself alive, and it's creating a crisis of confidence in the banking sector. As of April, problematic loans across the financial system totaled 5.2 trillion rubles, $66.2 billion, 3.2 trillion, $40.8 billion in corporate debt, and 2 trillion, $25.4 billion in retail. That's the official number. Ratings agency ACRA projects the actual figure could rise dramatically, reaching the equivalent of 20% of the banking system's total capital by the end of the year. If those loans begin to fail, and all indicators suggest they will, banks will face insolvency on a massive scale. But the state has little capacity for bailouts. The reserve fund is vanishing. Tax revenue is falling. Depositors, if asked to carry the cost, will face a familiar fate. In 1990s Russia, when banks failed, customers didn't receive their money back. They got promissory notes, IOUs, that quickly became worthless. That cycle could repeat, and this time it wouldn't be limited to a single institution. It would be systemic. Russia's financial unraveling is only part of the crisis. The energy sector, once the cornerstone of the country's economic strength, is now facing a breakdown of its own. Not long ago, oil and gas revenues underpinned the entire Russian budget. But since the Western oil price cap took effect, that foundation has steadily eroded. Between January and September 2023, Russian oil tax revenues had already fallen more than 40% year over year. By May 2025, the slide continued. Oil-related taxes dropped 32% compared to the same month in 2024, totaling just 430.4 billion rubles, $5.5 billion. Combined oil and gas revenues fell more than 35%, marking their lowest point since January 2023. That translates into billions in lost income, losses that even Russia's massive reserves can't cover indefinitely. To counter those sanctions, Moscow attempted an end run around the West, building a shadow fleet of older tankers not subject to Western regulation or insurance. The idea was to maintain exports without oversight, but the workaround has become a logistical nightmare. Transport costs from the Pacific port of Kozmino to China, one of Russia's key remaining markets, have increased fivefold. That's for a route to what is supposedly Russia's closest strategic ally. With costs rising and legitimate buyers dwindling, many Russian traders have resorted to storing oil offshore. As of January 10, 2025, an estimated 17 million barrels were sitting in floating storage, up from zero at the beginning of the year, according to Goldman Sachs. The message is clear: the world doesn't want Russian oil, at least not at the price Russia needs to stay solvent. And production cuts may now be inevitable. Several oil executives, speaking on condition of anonymity, admitted that a significant reduction is likely. For a country whose budget is tied directly to energy exports, that's a dire signal. Compounding the issue are attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure. Since January, Ukrainian drone strikes have hit 8 refineries, along with depots and other industrial targets. The result? An estimated 14% of the country's refining capacity has been severely disrupted. That may not seem catastrophic on its own, but in the current environment, it's a critical loss. Russia is already struggling to export crude. Without refining capacity, even domestic processing becomes a challenge. Repairing the damage isn't straightforward. Russian refineries were built with Western parts, Western technology, and Western expertise. Sanctions have cut off all of that. What remains is a hollowed-out industry. The energy superpower, once a dominant player in global oil markets, is discovering just how reliant it was on the very Western systems it now denounces. Without access to global markets, modern equipment, or reliable infrastructure, Russia is losing its ability to function as a major energy exporter. What was once its greatest strength is rapidly becoming another liability. As the energy sector falters, Russia's broader industrial base is in steep decline, and nowhere is that more evident than in its growing technological gap. The country once boasted of its military precision and industrial capability, but today, reports from the front lines tell a very different story. Russian military equipment has been found using semiconductors pulled from dishwashers and refrigerators, a clear signal of just how deep the shortages run. These aren't isolated incidents. The West's sanctions didn't just block the export of finished products, they severed access to the machinery and know-how needed to produce microchips domestically. Russia's own semiconductor production is severely limited. Even before the war, it was years behind global standards, and now that gap is growing. In late 2022, Washington barred U.S. companies from supporting the production of 16-nanometer chips and more advanced designs in China. Russia, which can't even manufacture chips at that level, has been left scrambling for alternatives. With no advanced domestic fabrication capacity, it now relies heavily on China for semiconductors, sourcing an estimated 70 to 90% of its chips from Chinese suppliers. The workaround? Smuggling outdated and overpriced chips through intermediaries. In 2022, Russia imported $2.5 billion worth of semiconductor technologies, up from $1.8 billion in 2021. But that higher cost doesn't mean better quality. Much of this equipment is low performance and acquired through unofficial channels, making it unreliable for modern applications. And the price? Nearly double what Russia paid before the war. The shortage has crippled Russia's ability to manufacture not just high-tech military equipment, but civilian products as well. Missiles require guidance chips, drones need processors. Even basic upgrades to vehicles or infrastructure now depend on unavailable components. Without semiconductors, entire sectors have ground to a halt. Factories once producing consumer goods have been hastily retooled to produce weapons and munitions. But these conversions are rarely efficient. The tooling is wrong, the workforce is mismatched, the materials are inconsistent, and the consequences are evident in both quality and quantity. What we're seeing is not just a pivot toward war production, it's a dismantling of Russia's modern manufacturing base. Civilian industries are being cannibalized for military needs, supply chains are breaking down, equipment is failing. And all of it is happening against a backdrop of rising costs, vanishing imports, and global isolation. This isn't just a technological setback, it's a step backward in industrial development, a regression that in some sectors may take decades to reverse. The collapse of Russia's industrial base isn't happening in isolation. It's feeding into a broader societal breakdown, one that's becoming harder to ignore. In 2023, Russian alcohol consumption surged to a record 2.3 billion liters of hard liquor. This isn't recreational, it's symptomatic. Experts have drawn comparisons to the Soviet Union's lost decade in the 1970s and 1980s, where widespread drinking was a coping mechanism for a collapsing system. And history shows us what followed that era, the Soviet collapse. Today's spike in alcohol use is being mirrored by a sharp rise in violent crime. In 2023, over 589,000 felonies were recorded, the highest figure since 2011. Russia isn't just fighting a war abroad, it's facing a slow implosion at home. The country's suicide rate is among the highest in the world, 24.1 per 100,000 people, and roughly half of those cases are tied to alcohol abuse. Behind those numbers are real stories. Laid-off engineers in their 50s, too old to be drafted, too young to retire. Their factories retooled for war, their careers erased, their savings gone, their homes fractured, their futures uncertain. The social infrastructure meant to support these individuals is failing too. Since 1991, male mortality has increased by 60%, 4 to 5 times the European average. Hospitals are short on basic medications. Medical professionals are leaving the country or being drafted into military service. Education isn't spared either. Teachers are going unpaid. Schools are closing, not due to war damage, but due to lack of funding and staff. This erosion is happening across the country. Times of hardship, crime spikes, not just out of desperation, but because people increasingly feel they have nothing left to lose. In 1995, nearly 75% of all those arrested for homicide were under the influence of alcohol. It's a pattern repeating itself in real time. This is not just economic pain, it's the fraying of Russia's social fabric. The decline is visible, measurable, and accelerating. While the national government tries to maintain control, the greatest threat to Moscow's authority may be coming from its periphery, the ethnic republics and minority regions. Over 20,000 individuals have already faced serious reprisals for anti-war positions. But what's alarming the Kremlin isn't just the number, it's the geography. These protests aren't centered in liberal hubs like Moscow or St. Petersburg. They're emerging from regions like Dagestan, Buryatia, and Yakutia, areas that have long been economically disadvantaged and heavily exploited for military conscription. In Crimea, 80% of draft summonses were issued to Crimean Tatars, a clear indicator of selective targeting. Similar trends are being reported in Buryatia and Tuva, where the share of men conscripted relative to population size far exceeds that of other ethnic Russian regions. This isn't incidental, it's systemic. Moscow is using ethnic minorities as cannon fodder, and those communities are starting to push back. In Dagestan, women have physically blocked roads to prevent their sons from being sent to war. In Yakutia, demonstrators have staged traditional dances to protest conscription, chanting "No to genocide." These aren't fringe activists, they're ordinary citizens who've reached their breaking point. Local officials now find themselves in an impossible position. They're expected to meet conscription quotas and suppress dissent, all while their regions face growing unrest, dwindling resources, and widespread frustration. Some are beginning to push back quietly. There are signs of slowed mobilization, efforts to retain more regional tax revenue, and subtle resistance to Moscow's demands. What makes this dangerous is that many of these regions control critical resources: oil in Tatarstan, diamonds in Yakutia. If they were to pull away economically or politically, it could further accelerate the national collapse. Putin's centralized system depends on loyalty from the provinces. But when the center weakens, the outer edges don't just lean away, they often break off. And for the first time in decades, that fracture is starting to look possible. Even as regional tensions rise, Russia is facing a deeper, more existential threat: demographic collapse. In the first 2 months of 2025 alone, the country experienced a natural population decline of nearly 119,000 people. It's nearly 120,000 more deaths than births in just 60 days. According to demographer Alexei Raksha, the number of births in the first quarter of 2025 likely reached the lowest level since the early 1800s, lower than during the Napoleonic Wars. This isn't a temporary dip, it's a long-term demographic spiral. Since 2020, each January has seen the natural death rate nearly double the birth rate. Russia is losing 2 people for every 1 born. That's not a population imbalance, it's a path toward demographic extinction, and the government knows it. Recently, Rosstat, Russia's official statistics agency, stopped publishing detailed birth data altogether. When a country hides its demographic numbers, it's often because the reality is too damaging to admit. By the end of 2024, the population had declined by 596,200, roughly equal to losing the entire population of Luxembourg in a single year. The issue isn't just how few children are being born, it's also who's not having them. Families are increasingly choosing not to have children in a country they see as unstable and without a clear future. Economic hardship, social unrest, and war are pushing birth rates to historic lows. In the first quarter of 2025, the fertility rate fell from 1.432 to 1.431 children per woman and dropping. In response, the Kremlin has proposed desperate solutions, banning child-free propaganda, restricting access to abortion, and even suggesting that women convicted of minor crimes be released from prison solely to give birth. These aren't policies, they're symptoms of panic, and the math is unforgiving. Low birth rates now mean fewer women of childbearing age in the next generation and even fewer children after that. The result is a shrinking, aging population with fewer workers, fewer soldiers, and fewer resources to support the elderly. This decline is being accelerated by war and exile. An estimated 640,000 Russian troops are currently deployed in Ukraine. Another million have fled the country since the war began. These people are not starting families. They're dying, injured, or permanently displaced. If current trends continue, Russia's population could drop from 146 million to 130 million by 2046, a decline of 16 million people in just 2 decades. And that's considered the optimistic forecast. The alternative? A nation of aging citizens with no one to support them, economically, socially, or militarily. A superpower in name only, surviving on memories and old headlines. Even as Russia faces demographic decline, social unrest, and industrial decay, another reality is setting in, one that may define the next phase of the country's identity: subordination to China. What began as a pivot to the east has quietly turned into economic dependence. In 2022, just 3% of transactions on the Moscow Stock Exchange were conducted in Chinese yuan. By May 2024, that figure had surged to 54%. And following U.S. sanctions on the exchange in the summer of 2024, the yuan now accounts for 99.8% of all currency transactions. Russia is no longer trading in rubles. It's operating inside a yuan-dominated financial system, one where Beijing sets the terms. The government describes this as diversification, but in practice, it's a shift from one dependency to another. China has quickly become Russia's primary supplier of military-use goods. In 2023, roughly 76% of such imports originated from Chinese companies. Without Chinese chips, Russian missiles don't fly. Without Chinese components, Russian tanks don't move, and Beijing knows this. China is now purchasing Russian oil and gas at steep discounts. In 2025, China is paying $261 per thousand cubic meters of natural gas, 35% less than the $402 paid by European buyers. With the West shut off and few alternative customers, Russia has no choice but to accept these prices. And when you only have one major customer, you don't negotiate, you comply. The geopolitical optics are striking. In a recent interview, a journalist from Sky News Arabia asked if Russia felt like a junior partner in its relationship with China. The question clearly irritated Putin, but the data tells the story. Russia is no longer operating as an equal to China. It's becoming a resource appendage, a supplier of raw materials, not a partner in power. This realignment has implications far beyond energy markets. It shifts the global balance, creating a bloc where Russia plays the role of enabler, not leader. And for a country that once envisioned itself as a counterweight to both the West and East, this outcome is as strategically humiliating as it is economically unstable. Taken together, the trends are unmistakable. Russia's national wealth fund will likely be depleted by 2026. Its banks are saturated with bad debt. Its technological edge has eroded. Its people are facing inflation, poverty, despair. Its birth rate has collapsed to levels not seen since the 1800s. Its ethnic regions are resisting central control, and its economic lifeline is now controlled by Beijing. This is not a temporary downturn, it's the systemic unraveling of a state. By 2027, Russia will be confronted with a stark decision: scale back its war and attempt recovery, or continue pressing forward and risk total collapse. And that's the danger. History shows that regimes facing collapse don't surrender, they escalate, they gamble, they lash out. Russia remains a nuclear power, a country with thousands of warheads and increasingly nothing to lose. That combination is what makes this crisis global, not just regional. If the state fails, the consequences will ripple far beyond its borders. A humanitarian crisis could send millions fleeing. Russia's nuclear arsenal will require international oversight. Power vacuums in critical regions could destabilize neighboring states, and China will be ready to fill the gaps, politically, economically, militarily. This is how 21st century empires collapse, not through invasion but implosion, not through conquest but corruption, not because of enemies abroad but because of rot within. Russia wanted to project fear. What it may end up projecting is pity. It wanted to be great, but it's heading toward irrelevance. And the year 2027 isn't a distant risk, it's a countdown. Every week, the clock ticks closer to a turning point. When it comes, the impact won't stop at Russia's borders. So here's the question: can Russia pull out of this tailspin, or are we watching the closing chapter of a once mighty empire? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to follow how this story unfolds, hit subscribe, because the next moves in Russia will shape not just its fate, but the future of the global order. Thanks for watching. This is Fall of Nations, where we examine the stories that shape our world. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember, empires that live by the sword die by the spreadsheet.